A cultura constrói as memórias que preservamos e os futuros que idealizamos. Cultura transcende barreiras, conecta corações, transforma realidades. Acreditar na energia que vem da cultura é acreditar que as histórias transformam os palcos, os ritmos e os cantos desse país. São nessas histórias que encontramos a alma e a diversidade de um povo. Celebramos essa diversidade, celebramos cada cor, cada voz, cada sorriso e cada emoção. A cultura é reflexo dos nossos sonhos. Investimos nesses sonhos há mais de 60 anos, porque acreditamos que a energia que vem da gente é a energia que impulsiona vidas. Shell, energia que vem da cultura. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. No poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. Onde toca um instrumento, um futuro desperta. Nas trocas de saberes, sonhos e oportunidades se concretizam. Dos projetos que todo mundo conhece, aos que todo mundo precisa conhecer, é valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Dizer que o Brasil é gigante não é nenhum exagero, mas um país desse tamanho não se move sozinho. Ele conta com mais de 200 milhões de gigantes, como eu e você. Gigantes que saem cedo de casa todos os dias, com força, dedicação, coragem, pelos trilhos, estradas ou aeroportos. Gigantes que não diminuem diante dos desafios, que não têm medo de distâncias, nem do longo caminho até os sonhos acontecerem. Por isso, só uma gigante como a CCR poderia estar ao lado dos brasileiros no desafio de mover este país. CCR, 25 anos. Mover o Brasil é para gigantes.
Let's move on to the next battery of exchanges empowerment. How wonderful was to have Sueli and Luanda Carneiro here. I really took the chance to take my picture with them. And so let's move on with this schedule, who is beautiful this Friday night. It's everything that Floop always dreamed, because part of the Floop is their audience, the faces in the audience. So let's move on. These are daughters of African migrants that inserted themselves in societies where they grew up, became journalists and narrators of the great colonialist crisis in the UK and in France. The two that were the two big empires in the world once. So we're gonna have translation for our panel. So please pick your phones on the table behind you. Their narratives are like the waters of the Atlantic, crossing borders in all senses of the world. They announce a world that is not, it cannot be new, because the future is always ancestor. And we know that far behind borders in exist. And one of the most prominent activists in France, according to the New York Times, Rokhaya Diallo is journalist, collaborator to the Washington Post, and member of the Guardian in Europe. Beside her dissolving boards, Afua Hirsch, writer, presenter, documentary, and ex-British lawyer, known by her work in terms of race and gender in media. She studied philosophy, economics in the University of Oxford before moving on in journalism. Mediation is by Floop's curator, who prepared all these attractions. The intellectual that succeeds Foucault, Barthes, Deleuze, from the French studies of the State University of New York in Buffalo, Numi Fatunian. Please come here. Applauses.
How are you? How are you? I'm super happy to be here. Was I here yesterday with you already? I feel like we're becoming best friends, you know. So I am, again, super happy, really, really, really happy to be back here today with two incredible, incredible women, forces of nature, for this conversation on you, on us, on work, blackness, womanhood, and dopeness, right? So my first question to both of you. So Afua, you were a former barrister, right? Rokhaya, you are the producer of one of France's most celebrated podcasts. You are the head of a public speaking school. Both of you, you are filmmakers, directors, columnists, journalists, filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, award-making documentary filmmakers. One question: when do you sleep?
It's very ironic for you to be the one asking that question.
No, that's a real question. You have incredibly busy lives, doing incredibly things in basic and in all of these things, doing it and killing it. How do we find balance? Like, how do you take care of yourself?
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Bonsoir. Je vais parler. Ah, il faut parler comme ça. Vous m'entendez mieux? Bonsoir. Je suis très heureuse d'être là.
I'm very happy being here. I want to thank Floopy for being here and this with beautiful people with this strength. Thank you for this debate that will allow us to talk about care in a very different way from what we have said before this afternoon. So I think we don't have the only ones. We're not the only ones, you know. Like we navigate through many activities, and how do we take care of ourselves? I think that's a very it has to do with discipline, you know, separate your personal spaces, you know, in terms of obligate yourself to not to work. From my side, what is my, you know, my environment that protects me and that allows me to have some sort of compass that is the center from which I organize myself. And it's a broad question.
Are you okay? Right? Okay, okay. Ça va? Are you okay? Are you good? Voilà, peut-être qu'on va prendre.
How do you find balance between all these activities?
Isso, como encontramos equilíbrio nisso, né? Obrigada por me receber aqui. Eu acho que a universidade vai...
I'll answer that question a bit differently. I learned this from a friend who said, he's also a very busy multi-hyphenate, who always says, I don't seek work-life balance because that doesn't exist. I seek work-life peace. And I love that because I think
work-life peace.
Work-life peace, because I think if you're someone who's on mission and your work is your sense of purpose, you feel you're doing what you were put on this earth to do, which I guess is all for all of us is the aspiration, then it's such a kind of Western construct, the idea that there's this binary between who you really are and your work. And I think a lot of us come from traditions where the work it's community, it's purpose, it's service. So I like to think of it as work-life peace. And I'm not romanticizing our lives. Obviously, we live in a capitalist society. We have to do work for economic reasons. We might not always be doing the things that we would choose if money was no issue. But the guiding principle I use is that, and I think you always know if something is off, if you're out of sync. And so I really embrace that work-life peace.
I really like this concept of work-life peace versus work-life balance. And actually, when we were working on your bio, so both of you are columnists, and someone from the staff asked, like, what does a columnist do? What is a columnist?
Well, a columnist, so if you're a journalist, I guess there are two main kinds of journalists. One is a reporter. That's somebody who goes out and sees what's going on and documents it for you. And there are a lot of rules involved in that in the journalism profession. You have to verify all your sources. You have to make sure there's balance. If you are reporting something that leans one way, you should try and balance it. That's also a problematic idea. Maybe we'll talk about that. It's not as straightforward as it seems, and there's so much potential for bias. But in general, a reporter seeks to document what's happening objectively outside of themselves. A columnist has permission to say what they think, and you're not seeking necessarily balance or objectivity. You are writing your authentic take. In my opinion, a good columnist has already thought about what people who disagree with them would say and has already incorporated that into their argument. But as a columnist, you're seeking to persuade, to influence, to share your worldview and perspective. So there's huge power in it. And, you know, traditionally journalism has tried to keep a very clear divide between the two. And I started as a reporter and I became a columnist, and that was seen as incredibly controversial because there's this idea...
It was seen as controversial by who?
By the establishment, the media establishment. It's like if you're a reporter, you're not allowed to be a person with a hinterland and a lived experience and a set of values. You're meant to be this bot who documents reality. It rests on this very Eurocentric idea that there is such thing as a neutral person. The reality is the neutral person is often a white man who has a set of values and lived experience, but that's regarded as neutral. And to the extent you deviate from that, you are seen as having all of this bias. And so that's something now as a professor of journalism, I really challenge us as a media profession to do better at understanding every human has bias because every human has a body and a childhood and an experience. And it's actually honesty about our bias rather than pretending it doesn't exist. That for me builds trust with an audience.
And for you, Rokhaya, one of the interesting things with you is that you work for newspapers in different countries. I really like what Afua say that, you know, as a columnist, you're invited to talk from your perspective and talk from your own experience. Do you feel that that voice somehow has to change when you work for the Washington Post or when you're doing a column or an editorial for another magazine from in another country? Do you think that you have to adapt your voices with the countries that you're working for, or do you remain Rokhaya and writing as Rokhaya?
Alors, c'est intéressant.
Então, the definition
the definition gave by a historian that we say in French, because who writes the editorials has the best of being a journalist, a reporter, and normally it's authorized to write this editorial. So there is this idea of authority. And what appears as being an editor is the same thing for the ones that are in the visual media, in the radio, in the newspapers. We talk about this editorialist. In general, we think above all of white men of a certain age. So there is a behavior that shows the experience. So he cannot bring so much complexity. So in France, working by radios and television, and when I started working for the American press and TV, I understood that they wanted me to position myself individually, to write in the first person. This doesn't happen in France, to write in journalism in the first person. This is not considered journalism because it's a loss of objectivity, which is a fantasy, because there's no objectivity completely possible. So we are not encouraged to write in the first person. We don't consider that what we live can inform the information. And for example, in certain newspapers, they oblige us to write in the first person what I observed based on my experience. This is completely different. I know that for the ones that write in America or in England, I couldn't write the same thing in the French journal because it would be perceived of bad quality. Because it's not supposed to have this. You have to be 100% objective, like an editorial. So português. Português. Yes. Português. Português.
Chronique ou l'éditorial, c'est pas un exercice qui se fait à la première personne, qui que soit la personne.
The editorial, it's the first person. So obviously, it's another issue. Why do I write to the foreign media if I live in France? This is another issue. The topics that I'm treating, this public person that I am, that I'm perceived, it's not perceived as being possible to write. So the only media that calls me are the ones of the English language. So when I write in English language, I write a lot better, of course, in French. So I don't know if there is a lack of interest, a way of demonization of my word in France, or an appreciation of the topics that interest me, that are kind of peripheral topics. So I write about French politics. I have a strong interest in gender and racial issues. And in France, it's very complicated to approach these topics because it's a kind of a negation, denying these issues and topics. I know I have a reputation that precedes me, and sometimes I'm not well seen in some places. And some French media, I never write without contradiction. So there is a paradox that I'm very visible, I'm very frank, but rarely I'm requested without having a contrary word that in a certain way is going to influence me. So my vision regarding what is happening, or when a man is accused of raping his wife and other 80 men, also it's a tragic event. So when I make this kind of interview about it, I'm considered a specialist in the topic. So also the policeman, the police worker. But in France, I have been seen as a contradiction. It's not the same thing. So in the
having this perspective of being considered as a journalist in your own country versus being, like an opinion maker or an influencer, right?
En fait, souvent, on me... Excuse-moi, tu veux répondre à la question, mais moi, ce que je... C'est pas insultant ou vraiment, mais en fait, c'est toujours...
Então, so I've always had at Figaro, for example, she introduced herself as a journalist as if I had invented my job. So it's always been dequalified the professional character of my experience to deal with a color that is subjective and emotional, but not forever. In the context that the rationality celebrated was a way.
Influencer, an activist, a militant, or someone who... Afua, how is home for you?
France is very triggering for me.
France is something. Bonjour, bonjour. Oui, oui.
We have problems in Britain to understate.
How is the reception of your journalism-ness? I mean, are you called a journalist? Are you considered a journalist? Is it...
My story is a bit different. I used to be a lawyer, as you said, and I became The Guardian, also The Guardian's legal correspondent. And it's funny, actually, I would never have had the audacity to apply for a specialist job at a newspaper if I hadn't been a practicing lawyer in the fields I would be reporting about. And it was only when I got to The Guardian that I realized that I was way overqualified than all my peers. And it was something about the kind of imposter syndrome, the inadequacy we feel, that I had to have had that experience to feel entitled to call myself a reporter. For me, I never set out to write about race. I never did. It's not because I'm not interested in race. I mean, my first book is about race and belonging. It's about ancestry, heritage. But as a journalist, I was a legal correspondent. I set out to write about international humanitarian law and war crimes and the Constitution. And this happens a lot to young Black journalists. You are in a newsroom where you are the only Black person. You see a story of huge social importance being covered atrociously. And you step forward because you can and because you feel a sense of duty. And then all of a sudden, you are the authority in your organization on race. And I have mixed feelings about that because it's not something that was forced on me. In a way, I embraced it. But it's not what I set out to do. And I always say to young journalists, if you want to use your voice to push the conversation about race forward, do that. Do it very intentionally, own it, but don't feel that you have to do that. If you want to write about space, write about space. You know, I think that we are reduced to talking about the fact that we exist by an industry for the wrong reasons. So I own everything I've ever written about race, but my dream is that there are so many Black journalists in the newsroom that the ones who want to write about race can, and the ones who don't can report on whatever it is they want to report on. I do also feel, though, that we have so far to go in European countries. I almost also don't feel that I have the luxury of not using my intellect and my voice to contribute because the need is so great.
You literally took the words out of my mouth, because for me it's one of the questions that I know that, that we are having in classrooms, that we are having in groups, that we're having at homes, when we have this conversation around the weight of this conversation, right? The weight of the race question, that it's not up to me to have to educate other people on Blackness. It's not up to me to have to educate other people on womanhood. But I will be the one suffering the consequences of racism, or I'll be the one suffering the consequences of misogyny. So how do you deal with what you say? It's true, right? So you want to give this advice, do what you want to do, but there's also this calling. And the calling starts because you are literally the first one suffering from being in an environment that doesn't know how to talk about you, how to cover you, how to deal with you. So how do you deal with that? This tension between not wanting to be the expert on race, but at the same time, you can't sit in a place and have people say crazy things about race.
Can I just,
right?
one thing I would say, since we're here in Brazil, I had not heard of Beatriz Nascimento until I came here.
Insane.
I'd never heard of her. It hurts me that I'd never heard of her because she had been creating an intellectual blueprint for the things I care about since like 20 years before I was born. One of the things that I am increasingly obsessed with is the scholarship of people who have already done this work. Because one of the things is that each generation feels that they have to do this work and they feel like they're starting from scratch. And the reason is that the legacy of people who already did it is erased, it's not visible, it's not translated into languages that we speak. And I think that it's a really big issue because if all of the women who'd already done this work, who already predicted the moment we're in and gave us tools to navigate it, if their work was visible the way it should be, I don't think I would have felt like I had to use my time to start from scratch. And it's a setup. So I say that because initially when I started writing in newspapers and being on TV talking about race and identity, I genuinely believed if I do this work with integrity, with thoroughness, I make the case in an articulated, well-researched way, everyone's going to listen and then they're going to become educated and then we can move to the next thing. It took a long time for me to realize it didn't change anything because the people that needed to be reached were not listening, and even worse, they were enjoying their ignorance. And they saw my efforts to reach them as a form of entertainment. And that is the setup, which is why I just think we have to focus on our purpose. If you feel you were put on this earth to advance this discourse, please do it, and thank you for doing it. But don't feel that you have to, because otherwise it won't be done. It has been done. It is being done. We will always continue to do it. And now I feel like it would be such a valuable use of my energy, not to keep creating new material, but to help elevate and amplify the work that is already there, so much of which is inaccessible. It's a crime.
And you, Rokhaya? So what would you answer? Thank you, my love. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. What would you answer, to people wondering, what should I do? I'm not here to educate people, but at the same time, oh my God, I can't let people say these crazy things. Like, how do you deal with that, starting with you?
Yes. Well, in a personal title and dimension, I took a long time looking at this debate with other people in the room, and really we had this frustration, this will of saying what I wasn't seeing, that I took this opportunity, not so much in a sense of mission and sacrifice. I didn't have the impression that I was depriving myself of doing something. It's because I like the exercise of debate. I like to fight because it's something that motivates me in life. Well, I like it. So this context of interaction, sometimes this classical context in France doesn't bother me. I don't have the impression I'm sacrificing something. And other spaces that I create, for example, I make documentaries, books, podcasts. So there are spaces that are more agreeable because we determine the frontiers. But I don't think that we need to go thinking that it's a mission, that we are going to deprive ourselves of something. It's not a good energy, and this doesn't bring anything good. And also, it's funny that we were talking before when in a situation of discussion, I don't think I have to win anyone that is also members of the panel. I think of myself at watching TV when someone was saying something. I think if one person is happy to hear me and is sharing this knowledge with me, it's enough for me. It's sufficient. But I think that effectively we shouldn't forbid ourselves of passing through other topics. If you really don't want to have other.
And it makes me feel good have the opportunity be present to say things that I don't unfortunately hear around, but what I'm sorry is that I'm convinced that I'm not the only one to say what I think and to think like this. It's simply because of, different situations. I am the one who had the opportunity to be in this moment and oppose myself and places, ideas. But once more, I hope that my presence will allow other people to be present too. And when it comes to transmission, this is important, evoke our information, what I said about taking the word, the speech in public. And I created this school because I had demand from other people, I have to go to this place and I have to speak. Can you, in public, can you give some tips? And I said, like, responded to individuals individually, it's something. But yes, they were journalists that were contact me through social media, or some others received messages. And when I'm not available, of course, I pass on to someone else, and we try to anticipate the questions. We try to create a strategy with them, and I learned a lot in the field. I would love it if people had taught me that before. So I want people to go on without making the mistakes I made. So starting from a distant point to go even further with respect to where I went. So talking about what you were saying, not knowing the people who preceded us, who came before us. This is part of this racial discussion, making so that each generation can go, not to start all over again, and waste time. And with the time that is given to us, we can capitalize on some knowledge and transmit it to the younger generations. What I learned, the things I went through, because evidently these taking the word, the speech is complicated. I've been through three different processes in 1 year. I was attacked because of defamation. People accused of defamation. They accused me of being implicated in terrorism. Yes, this really leads to consequences, and try to form and train people to avoid that they go through this and make, the mistakes I made, and at least avoid this and taking conscious decisions and anticipate consequence. What's different from what I have done, because I suffered the consequences and I am still suffering them.
One of the function of this system of racism is to waste your time, right? Distraction. And one of the best way we're being distracted is having this feeling that we're always having to start from scratch, and that everything has to be reinvented. And
even worse than scratch. I mean, I think one thing that we're seeing from the recent US election is that what we thought was the baseline, we're now going lower. Yeah. So if you spend all your time trying to bring people from the baseline to where you are, then the floor comes out and you reach a new rock bottom. Now you're going to stop and go backwards. You can't follow because the direction of travel is crazy. Do you know, in the UK, when George Floyd was murdered, people who weren't in the space of really focusing on how extreme racial violence is, were very shocked, and there were a lot of institutions that then wanted to have conversations. And during that time, I spoke to a veteran civil rights activist in the UK, a man in his 80s. He spent his whole life doing this work. And he said, kind of without irony, he said, you know, the really great thing about what's happening now is that before we were at -10, and now this gets us to 0. And I thought that was such a good metaphor, because how can you celebrate being at 0? At the same time,
better than -10.
When you've been at -10, it's progress. But that is where we are fighting for it to be recognized that there is a fight that needs to be had. We're not even doing the actual work. We're trying to advocate that there is work that should actually be done. And that's the cycle that I broke out of, because I could see that it was not actually leading anywhere. And in a way, for me personally, I felt like I exhausted the potential of -10 to 0. And that instead I was going to go to 0 and give myself a blank slate and use my imagination and find the work that has already been done and engage with it and start to be creative. Because, and this isn't in any way to dismiss that work. I did it. Many people are still doing it. You know, their voices are so crucial now more than ever. But I personally knew I couldn't stay in that cycle, because it's not a cycle you control. And it's not broken. It was designed to work like that.
It was designed to work like that, and it reminds me of some of, you know, the ideas that were shared yesterday by Oyeronke and Gloria on following a center, following a system that was, like you say, is not broken, but that is designed to not work for you, or it is designed to always keep you, like you said, -20 or -10. And when it brings you at 0, then you can feel like, you know, you've gone up, but actually you were still the ground. So this idea of creating your own centers, decentering the I, and being like working with these multiple I's, very important. So both of you are filmmakers, and you work a lot around documentary. Why documentary, and why this focus? In the millions of things that you do, you write books. Why documentary filmmaking? What was it with image that really caught you?
Well, I'll tell you my journey. I'm a writer. I am very much a written word person. From a very young age, I've loved books. I kept a diary from childhood. I'm a writer. It's my natural language. And I think it just came to a point around maybe 2008, 2009, I started to feel aware, even as a print journalist, that I needed to learn a visual language. You know, we were becoming into a kind of attention economy where people have a short attention span. They are addicted to visual stimulation. I would never have created that, but that's what we've got. And I'm not precious. I do the work because I want to reach people, so I try to reach people where they're at. So I went into TV and I did the same kind of journalism I did in print I was doing for TV. And guess what? It was so interesting because it made me a better writer.
Doing film?
Doing film and TV made me a better writer because it helped me build my visual vocabulary. And that translated into my writing as well. You know, when you're a TV journalist, so when you're a print journalist, you start with your strongest quote or the strongest idea. As a TV journalist, you start with your strongest image. And when I first became a TV journalist, I'll just give you an example. I was the social affairs editor at that time. We were covering a lot of stories about terrorism, about radicalization. And I got a scoop, which as a newspaper journalist would have been like a dream, amazing story. I got access to somebody who had been in Al-Qaeda, he'd been involved in terrorist plots. He now wanted to talk about his experience. He had all this knowledge. And I thought it was an amazing story. And it was really nuanced because he was actually a very empathetic character. You could just see all the forces at work. And when I took it to my editor at my TV channel, he was so not excited. And I was like, this is such a good story. And he was like, what's it going to look like? And he had to be anonymous to protect him. So it was going to be a blacked out face in a dark room speaking with his voice changed. And, you know, as a print journalist, there is no problem with that. As a TV journalist, it was not a story. It just wasn't a story. So that's just an example of how I had to really push myself out of my comfort zone and learn to work with image and learn to tell stories in a different way. And so it was a natural evolution from that to becoming a filmmaker. And of course, the frustration with TV news is it's so short form. You know, I would make 3-minute films every day, and they come and go. You know, you get a story at 10 o'clock in the morning, it needs to be on TV by 5 o'clock in the evening. It's not going to be a work of art. I mean, you try, but it's like just kind of throw the things in and try and make it work. And so it was such a luxury to have long form projects to work on that I really then embraced. But actually my journey continues because now I'm working on scripted film and TV. And that's because I feel like it's easy for me to formulate facts and ideas. And in a way, I'm reaching people who, the fact that they're even engaging with facts and ideas, they probably already agree with my worldview. The people that I am concerned about reaching are the people who don't engage with facts and rational ideas. We're living in emotional times. And you know, the reason the right, one of the reasons the right is so effective is that while the left is concerned with history and truth and analysis and statistics, the right just goes straight to your fear and your sense of threat and your anxiety, and it's powerful. And I worry that if people like me don't engage with emotion, we're going to outsource the realm of emotion to the right. And we know where that leads. It's so dangerous. So in a way, I challenge myself. I want to reach people emotionally with the same integrity of the message and the work, but I want to, when I'm really honest with myself, the things that have probably changed me the most in my life have been fiction, novels, films, plays, poetry, and I notice how they change me on a cellular level. And I want to see, and it's a challenge, if I can take all of the work I've done and the knowledge I have and the curiosity I have about the real world and infiltrate that realm of emotion. So that's the journey that I'm on.
Thank you, thank you. That's inspiring, really inspiring.
That's encouraging, I appreciate it.
Really inspiring. Okay, yeah. Why films? Why images?
Alors moi, je suis très sensible à ce que vient de dire Afua sur le pouvoir de la fiction et sur la faculté en fait que l'on a à s'attacher à des personnages.
And this can't be compared with other forms. For me, all of this is a contrary, truly. I always had facility to write, but I was never passionate by the writing. But the communication for me passes a lot through the image. I've always watched series, fiction, animations, Japanese animations, with some graphical narratives, very dynamics. Everything attracted me in this. I worked in the world of animation. I produced cartoons for a long time. I organized a series for youngsters with animations. And when I wrote the Anti-Racist Association, beyond the writing, there were some animations to denounce racism. It was a very familiar language to me. When I started working for television, I had the opportunity to work for a documentary, and they had the idea to create small documentaries to work as bridge and commentaries. A documentary is an object that lasts 50 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, but at the same time, it's an object and it takes a distance from us, and there is no incidence regarding the circulation of this document. So there is something that is presented second by second from the beginning to the end. with animation. I like very much animation. I like using animation together with fiction. So for TV Sunk Monde, I worked and I was wondering how is it transmitted to the whole world if someone in Vietnam it doesn't know me and watch something that I produced. I think it's going to be something incredible. So the power of images is fundamental, and also the power of fiction is always something extraordinary, because I'm talking about mainly about the writing of cartoons, something that I enjoy so much. Printed cartoons. I wrote a lot together with a writer called Prince. I wrote about the destiny of some women that escape some stereotypes. And I thought it was really wonderful to create these characters. Thank you very much, Rokhaya.
So you are both unicorns.
Né? Reino Unido, França. E eu lembro de crescer na França nos anos 80, 90, e literalmente tinham duas mulheres na TV. E é um país com muitos negros, né? E eu acho...
Audrey Pulvar, right here, literally, two black women on TV. And the second one was in politics, Christiane Taubira. She's here. Flu. I grew up seeing two black women on TV my entire childhood, teenagehood, and the beginning of my adult life. And now you are on TV. Same thing in
Not
the
so
UK.
much in France.
Yeah, right. You're in the UK. So what it is to be, we could have you on here, Audrey. What it is to be a black woman journalist working on the topic, because you touched on that. You would love to see other black journalists, young black journalists working on science fiction, working on agriculture. What it is to be a black woman journalist in Europe today in the 21st century, 2024, working on womanhood, working on race. Both of your works, I'm just thinking of two titles. One of your books is called Ne reste pas à ta place, Don't Stay Where They Told You to Stay. One of your book is called, one of the absolutely incredible book, Decolonizing the Bodies. So around, refusing injunctions, refusing the seat that you were told, that -20, right? Or that zero. What it is to be a black woman today working around these issues in Europe. Do you want to start, Rokhaya?
Merci en tout cas pour ce rappel.
In TV, I have some, memories. And I have memories of terrible things in TV when I was a child. With programs like Club de Hotel, like, a show for kids in France with images, crazy images of what we were as kids. And you said about being a black person and living in a world that is not thought for our bodies. And in the beginning of the year, in the beginning of 2010, they required makeup, and when we were black and have to make up this, to make makeup, this is really complicated. She was trembling. She was not okay. She didn't seem like, a person that was making my makeup was trembling, and I wasn't really prepared for that. She, put a blush that had nothing to do with my skin color, and then prepared me for a world. Audrey Pulvar has to do with what you said before. Since Audrey left that place, yes, I think that remained in relation to black women. But that means that we need to create our own spaces, open spaces for ourselves. And every year, I think, well, I'm gonna, start a polemic. Like 15 years that I've been thinking how I could survive in a hostile environment that is source of controversies and polemics. So much polemic for nothing, to the point that I surprised myself. As pessoas
of your hair was blonde, so you were appropriating whiteness by having, and it was a huge thing on TV.
Oui, enfin, c'est vraiment des polémiques.
Yes, it was like bad quality things, but at the same time they occupied a lot of space. And I also make this question, bring this questioning with me. Is this a project that I cannot reach, but at the same time, as a left-wing person, a black person, can work in an organized way and translates what I actually think in certain sense, but we need to somehow create capitalism and benefit from it. And I think, should we start in this context? Even so, I realize this symbolic role that I have. Even if I didn't say anything, the fact that I'm there in TV with my name, my last name, an African last name, the curly hair, all of this is in universe and makes sense to people that are looking at me. So if it then clearly beyond the quality of my arguments, and this is a very experience of debating of this is also hostile. In the beginning I had this sensation that it was some sort of being hostile to older people, because they didn't understand why someone like me, my age, becoming so popular, achieved to arrive to arrive there. Because besides, there is some sort of tacit convention in France. When you belong to a racial minority, you have to have some sort of gratitude to France and thank you. Say like, thanks to France, I arrived here. And this makes me seem something really insolent person. Because we should feel grateful when I am satisfied to be here, and many people didn't make it. So it's important to say that I have fun doing what I do. I have fun. In fact, really, it makes me laugh to see like how people feel uncomfortable in face of this provocation, and I'm sitting down here digging into this situation. It's just like a game.
That little rock.
Como uma pedra no sapato. E essas são perguntas que todos perguntamos, né? Na universidade eu também tenho estudantes que vêm me perguntar se eu estou sendo complacente com o sistema, porque o capitalismo é muito legal, você colocou isso, em gerar críticas e se aproveitar dessa crítica. E nós somos palhaços do sistema, parte do sistema, né? Mas no final do dia, você estar ali é importante. O que você representa e que você está se divertindo.
Thank God for you, Rokhaya. I won't do it anymore. The moment I snapped was unfortunately captured live on air.
Are you still doing debates on live TV? No. Not anymore.
You
are. Yeah.
I literally had a moment. It's funny because one thing you won't see me doing is acting. I'm a terrible actor. One of the problems is I can't rearrange my face. So when people are saying crazy stuff,
your eyes roll.
Yeah, I think I'm doing a great job, but I'm really not. I was just telling this story. We had a debate. It was me, and it was a regular show. It was very popular. It was me and 4 white panelists. Usually They represent a cross spectrum of this political opinion. Some are on the left, some are center, some are right. But whenever it comes to race, they will subconsciously all gang up against me. Always align.
Always, yeah.
And we had this debate that I just had enough. I'll tell you a story about how this is playing out in the UK. There's a woman who anchors the BBC breakfast show. It's literally the most watched show in the UK. She's not black, she's South Asian, but she's a dark-skinned South Asian woman. And she's, as you would expect, BBC breakfast anchor, never says anything political, never says anything controversial, and her co-host is a white man. And one day he asked her, this is the last time Trump was president, how he'd said something racist, breaking news, and her co-host asked her, has anyone ever said something racist to you? And she said, yeah, actually, I grew up with a lot of racism. And he said, how did that make you feel? And she said, it made me feel really shit, actually. She got disciplined by the BBC for violating impartiality by expressing a prejudiced view about the president. And I ended up running a campaign to reinstate her. And the reason was, if the message is, as a black woman, you can only be on TV if you pretend to be neutral about people expressing violent racism, then the message is, this is not a place where any black person can work.
I mean, the very question to ask to a black person who grew up in
By
the UK,
the way, the white co-host who asked the question, no discipline, no censorship, no punishment. And it was just the best example of something we experience on TV in the UK all the time. Your presence is conditional on a level of assimilation. They want you because you're black, but they don't want you to be too black. They want you to perform a version of being minoritized that works for them and makes them comfortable. And the minute you stray outside that accepted performance, you become a problem. And I just got to the point where I felt personally I couldn't participate in it anymore. And I spoke about that. But, you know, I'm not advocating that we boycott the mainstream media. I still work in the mainstream media. We're constantly having to navigate that boundary between legitimizing something that's not legitimate and sharing our voice. But I would say, again, back to our current political situation, the big problem now is false equivalence. As voices that are more and more extreme are being normalized and incorporated into mainstream news and programming, there's this idea that, you know, you have this far-right misogynist, and then you have a black woman, and they kind of balance each other out. I'm the voice of anti-racism, and he's the voice of racism, and so it's some kind of balance. And, you know, for me, it's so clear this is not balance. There are some voices that have no place in a democracy. They are fundamentally antithetical to our values. The example I give is, imagine rape. You would not have, in a conversation about sexual violence, a pro-rape voice. Nobody would think you need that for balance. Why, when it comes to racism and anti-black hatred, is there this idea that if you're going to have someone like me, I need to be matched with somebody who has violent and dangerous ideas? And I feel so strongly about it, so I won't participate in any conversations with anyone like that. And the reality is those people are now starting to pop up more and more because they feel emboldened. Programmers will say, well, it's not extreme anymore because they're represented by the President of the United States. So, you know, I don't know what the solution to that is, but I know very clearly how I feel about it.
How you feel about it. Thank you, thank you. I mean, you've shared some tips, some tools from two women working in Europe, but also across oceans, right? Rokhaya, you also write and work in the United States. You have filmed all over the world. You have filmed here in Brazil.
I have filmed here in Brazil.
You filmed here. Can you tell us a bit about that? And also one thing that I wanted to ask, and that has been for me the first question that I ask anybody that I meet here in Brazil. What does it mean for you to be here? What does Brazil mean for your work? Past, now, and future? Who wants to start?
That's a huge question.
That's the next year's debate.
I'm always learning in Brazil, and I'm always humbled because I suspect everyone in this space has not been educated by their school or university on race, on the history of Black people, on Black resistance, on Black culture. Nowhere in the world is that incorporated into the syllabus. So anyone who's interested in those subjects has been on a program of self-education. And I have been on that course of self-education for a long time. And I feel relatively well educated now. Like, I have been doing the work and reading the material. And then I come to Brazil and I'd never heard of Beatriz Nascimento. Like, it's
João Candido.
I had to go and read the exhibition there about João Candido, who came to England, by the way, and worked with the shipbuilders in Newcastle who influenced his radical politics. So it's so humbling how ignorant someone like me still is about the history of Brazil. And so I'm also now on this lifelong journey of self-education here. What I was filming here in 2019, I was making a documentary series with Samuel L. Jackson that was an attempt to tell a story about transatlantic enslavement from a very different lens. So we were excavating the ocean. The idea is that the Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard for Africans. There are thousands of wrecks, an unknown number of bodies who lie unburied. You know, when you fly over the Atlantic and it looks just like still water, underneath it is so much trauma still. And that actually, because the diving community globally is very white, it's a very privileged activity. Nobody has been really, apart from a few exceptions, there have not been serious attempts to excavate these remains. So we set out to make the series that would really tell the story from the ocean, what is down there, to try and also, I think that the history of enslavement, it's often very abstract, especially in Europe and America. It's, you know, drawings, it's numbers and statistics. All of the things that we should be able to see often have been destroyed or erased. And this is a very tangible history. The things are there. So we were here, we filmed at Valongo, told the story about how it was only the Olympics, the reconstruction of the Olympics, that really forced the city to confront the built environment that's here. And I really had the privilege at the wharf of seeing some of the things that were excavated from Valongo. The two things that I'll never forget was, one was a pipe that an enslaved woman had brought with her from West Africa. It's such a small thing, a pipe. But you know, when you think of people surviving the Middle Passage, it hadn't occurred to me they would have managed to smuggle some personal item that would give them comfort. It was just such a humanizing thing. And it just made me think about this woman, that she still had her pipe. She was still planning on smoking her pipe. They couldn't take that away from her. That really reached me, and we filmed with this pipe. And the other thing that really got to me that I will never forget is that when they found the mass burial sites where 30 to 40,000 Africans were buried, I was thinking, you know, you survive the Middle Passage, and then you get here, and then you die. Maybe despair, maybe the extent of what's awaiting you. But when people died, people at the time threw their household trash into the graves. And that really got to me.
Put it on fire.
And burned it. And you know, as Africans, how you are buried, in some cases, it's even more important than how you live. You know, we place such huge emphasis in our cultures on burial, on rites of passage, on the afterlife, and it's the ultimate disrespect and ongoing trauma. So, you know, to see those things and then be visible was a real privilege. But obviously, the other thing that we filmed here was the cultural innovation that Black people have been creating here. We went to Quilombo, we went to Pernambuco and Bahia, and nothing could have prepared me. My mother's from Ghana. I've spent a lot of my life in West Africa. Nothing could have prepared me for how African it was. And that was one of the most energizing things that I've ever filmed, just to feel like the survival of our culture and our heritage. So that's the kind of roller coaster ride for me of coming here, being confronted with the extent of the wrong and then being humbled by the scale of the survival.
Thank you, thank you. Rokhaya.
Bon, moi,
Well, at the beginning of the year, at the region, I was invited by a black director in Caruaru. It was a place that I didn't know, and I was impressed by the dimension, the African dimension of the entities, of identities, of the local culture. But what moved me the most to show you my documentary in Caruaru was to share similar experiences. This documentary is the one I made long before this new one. And I was very moved to see that even with the distance that and the ocean that divides us, to see these similarities in identities, I was very impressed, both at the documentary and the experience itself. After they saw the film, I talked to people and they said that they would denounce the situation presented in the documentary. So for me, to be in Brazil is an opportunity to discover so many things. I had never heard of Beatriz Nascimento, but it was an incredible opportunity. And also to discover a series of racial issues that I ignored. The direct connection that I have with people not speaking the same language is something incredible. I think it's very hard to describe, but for me, it's a faculty of being able to travel inside of an emotion in connections connected to this history. So it's always a pleasure. It really moves me, this interaction with people. And we can say at which point we are connected due to everything that happened to our ancestors.
In Senegal, they say that blood pings. You know what ping mean? You know, when two phones that are connected, when they get next to each other, they vibrate. And in Senegal, they say that when you get close to your cousin, and this is something that the gods did so you won't marry a long-lost cousin that you don't know. So when you get close to a long-lost cousin, your blood vibrates, and this is what happens to us. And I think it relates to something that you both said, this work, that is a painful work, right, of excavating, of going, looking at the ocean, which is a place where we go have fun, we go to the beach, but then thinking of what is laying, right, in the ocean. And this is what we're doing here when we try extending across the ocean, across languages. It's really fun for me to walk around and see people talking with hands. And it always, like you say, ends with the Uggs, right? It's the blood that is pinging. And what it means for us, what it means for you, what it means for you, Afua, to be here and to find this other piece of our mosaic of the diaspora. And this brings me to my next question. What does the Atlantic means for you in your work? Not Brazil, the Atlantic. And do you consider yourself transatlantic woman? Is it a word that you use, transatlantic? And what does the Atlantic means for you?
for me, in a literal sense, all the places that haunt me are on an Atlantic coast. You know, I go to Ghana and Senegal. I go to America. I come here. I go to the Caribbean. I'm constantly drawn to Atlantic sites because I'm drawn to places where we are. I'm drawn to this. I'm drawn to this culture, this energy, this joy. I mean, this is by far the most joyful literary festival I have ever been to. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I don't think I can unsee it. I've seen it. It's like a magnetic force. I will always drift towards us, and this is where we are. We are literally distributed along Atlantic lines. So it's, even if I didn't have a vocabulary for it, it is my identity. And now we also have a vocabulary for it. I mean, all these scholars who have been creating these narratives about the Atlantic and these artists. And, you know, for me, this is the thing that gives me most hope, that we are just continuing to move constantly, like our levels of creativity, innovation, imagination. We're telling stories in ways that I couldn't have even have imagined when I was growing up. And so the Atlantic space, it's, whether I own it or not, it's just facts. It is part of who I am, and it's part of my story.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Afua. Beautiful. Okay, yeah.
Je pense que c'est... Enfin, j'ai...
With respect to Atlantic, I come from Senegal, and whether in France or in Senegal, both countries are in the same Atlantic line, but with historical different positions. But due to forces of circumstance, my work transmuted me to this intellectual interest, to the fact that I could find myself on the other side of the Atlantic, not by choice, but because these places, the Atlantic is the symbol of how French like me circulates, and I go on and I continue this route going up and down in issues that echo.
So this doesn't happen in an explicit way. No, it happens in an explicit way in my work for things that were generated by history.
Beatriz Nascimento said, and that is one of the foundation of her work, when she says, "I am the Atlantic," right? And thinking in her thought, this space became not just a geographical space, but a true space of liberation that allows you. I mean, just think of you. I mean, for me, you are Beatriz Nascimento's Atlantic. If in your country it's hard to be a journalist, you're writing for the best newspapers in the United Kingdom, in the United States. So it becomes this huge space that allows you to escape the tininess, the insanity of the national borders, right? It's become a borderless space where if Brazil was crazy for her, what did she do? She crossed the Atlantic and went back home. So I think we have two more questions. And I'm thinking about this one in reference always to Beatrice. If you had the opportunity to meet your 10-year-old self, what would you tell her?
In a way, that's such an easy question because everything I do is for my younger self. She drives all of my work. I'm always trying to...
You say everything that you do now is for your 10-year-old self.
Not necessarily 10-year-old. I mean, sometimes my 10-year-old self, sometimes my 15-year-old self, sometimes my 30-year-old self. I'm always trying to reach her, not in a narcissistic way, but just because I know that there are so many other hers. And she was a product of a society that didn't equip her, didn't have the answers for her, didn't love her the way she deserved to be loved. And that's, in a way, it's like my healing. I'm always trying to heal and rectify and do the right thing for her. And whether I like it or not, like that is what compels me. So and you know, it's funny because, you know, as a writer, writing is a very strange thing. It's very private and it's very insular and it's very intimate. And even though you really want people to read your books, it kind of doesn't occur to you that anyone will until you see people reading your books. And especially my first book, where I really didn't believe anyone would be interested in it, I was doing it for my younger self. And then when people read it and it reached them and it moved them, it was such a powerful thing, because I realized that my younger self wasn't alone. There are so many hers. There are so many other people going through the same thing with the same struggles, the same questions, the same searching. And that was one of the most powerful things that's happened to me in my life, to realize that this person that I always thought was alone had a huge community globally. And now I reach that community through my books. So it's literally the reason why I write.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Rokhaya.
Okay. Moi,
Okay.
simplement,
I think that I could never imagine being here with you talking to you this Friday night. This was, unthinkable. So, what I really want to say is that everything should be allowed to this girl, that she will not censor herself. And I really want to say that for my inner child, is that she is capable of doing whatever she wants. In terms of, message, is to say that her life will be full of surprises.
Will be full of surprise, like sitting here on a Friday night in Rio de Janeiro. And I want you, every single one of you tonight, when you go home after brushing your teeth,
Forem para casa antes de dormir, quero que vocês olhem para vocês no espelho e pensem que vocês estão olhando para vocês com 10 anos e digam a essa menina alguma coisa, a essa menina de 10 anos. E digam alguma coisa sobre um livro, um projeto, escrevendo alguma coisa. Ligam.
mean they were to you, do it tomorrow or start doing it. So this was a question that I got from the audience for you. We have 3 students who are in journalism school here in Rio de Janeiro, and who wanted to know what were the worst experience or the hardest lesson. You have the choice. Either the worst experience or the hardest lesson that you learn from being in journalism or from being in public life. Let's go with hardest lesson. It's better.
I can go first. It's the hardest lesson, but also a really useful one. So when I started writing about not even so much race, but Britishness and identity, and critiquing the story Britain tells itself about who it is and its history, I started to get trolled, not by like random angry people on the internet. I get trolled by them too, but by like editors of newspapers, members of the House of Lords. The establishment started trolling me. And it was so interesting because they never critiqued my work. They just attacked me. They would say, you should be more grateful to be in Britain. We let you into our educational institutions and this is how you thank us. If you don't like it here, why don't you leave? They would talk about my childhood. I grew up with privilege, so I'm not allowed to have a narrative about what's wrong with the country. It was so interesting, and they would really go into detail, like picking apart, where I grew up and the schools I went to and my parents' backgrounds. And at first it was really, as a journalist, I never wrote anything personal, and I wasn't used to that level of personal attack by such high-profile people. So it it was scary, it was painful. But then I realized that they actually weren't critiquing my work. And the reason they weren't critiquing my work is that they couldn't find anything wrong with it. Facts were facts. My research was watertight. Everything was sourced, verified. I had all of my sources. And there was nothing, it was...
So if they can't attack the work, they will attack your hairstyle, for example.
They will attack everything about me, you know, everything, my name, my hair, my complexion, the street that I grew up in, everything. And in a way, that was very hard. But now I take it as a compliment. Because I'm like, you tried so hard to find something wrong with the work that you were reduced to talking about, like, the size of my nose or...
So taking the trolling almost as a distraction. So is it one advice that you'll tell them, do not take the bait of being distracted and stay focused on the work that you want to do?
I don't want to be dismissive because it's obviously so problematic the way, particularly as a Black woman, you're so disproportionately attacked and harassed.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you have to give yourself permission to feel the trauma of that. That's not acceptable. It's painful. So I'm not saying just man up and don't get distracted. However, also analyze the nature of, I mean, don't follow it, one, because it doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve you. It's meant to intimidate you and distract you. And there is a way in which you can reject it. But also, when they attack you personally, it's feedback that they could not attack your work. That's what they want to do, but they can't. And so now it gives them strength.
100%. And Rokhaya, something that was a hard lesson that you learned and that would be valuable for the students who are present here.
I would say that for us to perceive the integrity of the work, truly there is no, how can I put, there isn't a precision, or it's not the integrity or the quality of the work that is going to bring a kind of recognition. We were created with this idea of working hard is going to give you good scores, but the work done with honesty, we imagine that's going to be retributed. This is something we have to renounce in this journalistic universe. We believe that this myth of the good student is going to deserve a retribution. This is just a myth. In fact, the violence of the intimidations of the critics is really impressive, especially if you are a Black woman. On the Black women that express themselves, that becomes a threat for men. And regarding the harassment, is a quantity, enormous quantity of women that are harassed in the journalism. So we are always in risk of insults and of harassment. I understand that when I'm insulted, which happens frequently in a violent way, is that I learn how to dissociate the target from my person. I'm not the target. This is not part of my person, my individuality. And there is a majority of people that believe in something, but it doesn't have to do with me. It's not part of me. Through my work, I help them understand that they are in a status quo that benefit them, not me. I learned to keep, in my analysis of the situation, to keep myself sober and not to let myself be too impacted by these aggressions. This is all connected to fantasies, and it doesn't have to do with my defects or competences. It happens all women because all of us were exposed to insult, attempts of intimidation, and this happens to us, will happen to the future women, and it happened with the ones in the past. So the idea is not to take this personally. It's not to pretend it didn't happen, but rationally, I think it's another thing that is at stake.
Para responder ele. Urgente.
They are not injunctions. It's tips from how you navigated these waters, how you're still navigating them, how you survived, how you were thriving, falling sometimes, getting back up. And that from what I hear, the most important thing is to talk to oneself, try to situate yourself, try to center yourself, even if it's hard. We know that the materiality of the conditions are here. Insults, hurt, the rape threat, all of this has a weight for you. It has a weight for people who love you, but you have a focus and you try to keep that focus. We have one last question. I'm going to ask you a really, really, really short answer. What? Right? We have 3 minutes left. What is in the future for you? What is in the future? Our panel was on borders, right? Pushing borders, destroying borders, reimagining borders, being a border. You are a border. I mean, some people see you as a border for whatever imagined worlds that they are trying to build, and you're here, I say, like, the soar, the big rock in their shoe. What do you see? Where do you see yourself in 5, 10 years? What is the future looks like for you?
This is maybe going to make me sound like a questionable person, but control.
Control.
Control. So as a journalist, as a creative, you start out making content for platforms you don't control. And you have no control over it. You do your best, you do your work with integrity and intention, and then you put it out. And it profits somebody whose values aren't aligned with you. You don't have any editorial control over the final product. And, for me, my life has been a journey of, clawing more and more of that control. I've started to be really interested in the platforms, the spaces, who owns them, who controls them, who polices them, who gatekeeps them. And so, for me, it's not enough anymore that the content I create is what I want to create. I'm insisting on having more control over the whole ecosystem. And I really want us all to do that. So that's my message.
Yay. Control space.
It makes me sound
context.
like
No, I mean, I get you, girl. I hear you. I'm with you. I am with you, Rokhaya.
Je pense que j'irai dans le...
What matters to me is to create spaces now. We will go back again to this control issue. With respect to me, I want that in spaces where we have expression, that the spaces are mine too. I want to become mine. Create more possibilities for these spaces to appear. There were hybrid forums in a podcast. So where I was, feeling that I belonged, and that everyone could feel that they belonged, where you can denounce something. It's important to dominate these spaces, allowing for beauty and imagination. I think this is so important to be there and demand this aesthetical and artistic thing that makes me feel good. Spaces to laugh what beautiful things are, and we decide from A to Z what is shown and spoken about. be part of our time. Faire partie.
They will not say it the way I would have, right? So we create content. We do create content, but are we the one benefiting from that content? And I hear you. You don't have to blush out from saying that control. Who control our content? Who control our narrative? Who controls all the things that we create? And I think that at the individual level, it doesn't matter. I mean, I spoke to 3 students who are they have their little channel, they're on Instagram. I told them, go create, make it, control what you're saying. And I hear you. And I hope that I'm really excited to have done this with you, really excited to see what you're going to do in the future. And we'll keep the fingers crossed for you. Lots of love. Thank you so much for the time, for the energy, for what you've been doing, for what you're continuing to do. And we will keep telling our stories ourselves. Merci beaucoup. Woo.
Merci Mme Fatou pour cette animation. Et merci beaucoup.
Muito obrigada. Thank you so much, all of you. I'd like to thank the translators. Thank you.